Alright, got a whole mess of heads we're doing this week in the shop, doing some valve jobs. So I've got a couple of John Deere heads that we're doing. We're going to just kind of take you guys through the process this week and just show you everything we do on these heads. Try to make it a quick video. And right now I'm pulling the valve seats out of these so we can get it up on the surfacer. We're going to be doing seats, guides, the whole works on these things.
This first head here is a 6068 John Deere, and the customer did overheat this, so we're going to be pulling all of the seats out. We're going to be surfacing the head and just starting here with running the TIG torch around the seat. That allows it to cool and shrink, and it'll pop right out.
Alright, so first head up on the surfacer. Sometimes people ask why we do this first. It just kind of depends on what machine is open. Right now the valve machine is tied up, so I'm going to do the surfacing first. Plus, we have to have a good surface to cut our seats to the correct surface depth because the valves have to protrude or be receded from the deck of the head a certain amount. So we like to have our surface done first. I know this head was pretty hot. I'm going to take 3/1000ths on the first pass.
Here you can see right in the middle of this head where it hasn't cleaned up at all. That's because it is warped from being overheated. So we're going to have to go ahead and take a few more thousandths off of it. But with a couple more thousandths at 5/1000ths total off the surface of the head, we are flat again. While the first head was surfacing, we're getting the seats pulled out of the 466 John Deere. That is the second head we're working on in this video. Sometimes after welding the seats, they will come right out. Other times they do stay a little bit tight still, so I'm using a brass freeze plug if I have to pry on them, just so I won't damage the head any. Sometimes as soon as you get them out, all that pressure that's built up just has to go somewhere. The second head here was warped as well, but we got the surface taken care of and moved on to the manifold side.
How much have you taken?
That cut I'm taking right now is going to be 5,000, so I've already got 3 off of it.
While that head's over there surfacing, I'm getting ready to drill the guides out on this head. So I'm getting leveled up.
As you can see, the manifold side on these heads is always pretty bad, so we pretty much always surface them when they come in.
Yeah, and it's not cleaned up yet, so let's take another 5, see what it looks like.
Now you can see we've got just a little bit of a nasty edge here where the top of that guide was. So I'm going to go back in with, it's just a piloted drill bit, and we'll just clean that edge up real quick. So on a lot of heads, I use kind of a universal guide that fits a lot of different engines. On this head, I'm using the guide that is actually meant for these heads. The exhaust guide is shorter than the intake guide. So I'm going to be going in and installing these, just making sure that we get all of the intake guides in the intake holes and all of the exhaust guides in the exhaust hole.
It's always important to use some kind of lubrication when you're pressing in guides, and I always use the Goodson Press Fit Lube. So when I was driving that guide in, I was feeling on the combustion side to feel when the guide was flush with the casting. And then after double checking that the guide height measures correctly, I set up a stop so that I can press in all of the guides to the same exact stop and make sure that it looks good on both sides. Finally, we're ready to go in and size our valve guides, so we're going to be using our Goodson Diamond Valve Guide hone. This allows us to accurately size the valve guides for the exact valve clearance that we want. Obviously, this is important for the operation of the engine, but it's also super important for having the right size for my Surrey pilot so that I can cut the seats as accurately as possible. Because if the pilot is too loose, I won't get a good seat, and if the pilot is too tight, it's going to seize up and it's going to ruin the valve guide. We are doing new intake and exhaust seats, so we're getting the new valve seat inserts installed, and then we're going to move over to the Surrey so that we can finish out the seats. On the Surrey, I have been using a combination of both the clamps that are with the fixture of the Surrey as well as an additional bolt down to tie it down just in the middle. I'm finding that that helps keep these bigger heads a little more rigid.
Taking a look here, you can see the seats that we've installed already have an angle on them, but because we installed new guides, you still have to go back in and touch up the seats. There's no way that they'll seal the way they are. The intake is supposed to be 24 below the surface of the deck. That's the minimum, and the exhaust is supposed to be 48 below the deck at the minimum. So we want to be as close to those numbers as possible, but not any above those. And measuring here on the exhaust, that's right at 48 or 50, so we don't have a lot of room there if we want to keep it on the high side of spec. On the intake, we're right around 20, so we've got 5 or 6 thousandths there that we can cut it. So we are going to end up below those by the time the seats clean up, but let's get in here and cut them. The cutter I'm going to be using here on both the intake and the exhaust is a 60 thousandths wide seat angle. It's a 3-angle cutter. On the main angle there, it is a 30-degree seat, and this one again is 60 thousandths wide. This is a Goodson cutter. Obviously, I've gotten a lot of use out of it. It's probably about time to get a new one. I've modified it here to make the top angle a little shorter, but that's what we're going to be using to cut both the intake and the exhaust seats on this thing. They are allowed to be between 60 thousandths and 80 thousandths by the specification, but we're going to keep these on the thinner side at 60 thousandths. So the other thing I should note, on our valve, that's where the valve face is currently seating. So you can see it's pretty far out towards the edge. It's in a good spot. So we're pretty much just going to match the current seat with this cutter and then just clean it up. Hopefully you can see there's just a tiny little gap of air under the seat angle. That's because my bottom angle on the cutter is just up to where the 30-degree on the seat is. So if I, obviously if I brought this way back in, you can see there's still light there, but it's kind of the opposite. The top angle of my cutter is on the seat angle. And I could bring it to exactly a match, which, let's do that, which would be about like that. But if my guides are off a little bit, it's not going to clean up and we're not going to have the full seat angle. So I'm going just ever so slightly bigger since we already checked on our valve and we have a little bit of room. And I think about like that is going to be good. I'm going to try around 480 RPM. There it is. I actually sped up to 717. So there we're at 20. Need about 5 thousandths more. Actually gave it a little too much. We're 27 now. But I'd rather be, you know, just under that. I don't want to play in games and have a customer have pistons kiss the valves. So on the intake, you can be anything up to 44 thousandths and still be considered new, and the maximum is 64 thousandths. So if we're at 27, we're still in a good spot on the intake.
Intake seats are wrapped up at this point. We're ready to move on to the exhaust, but I wanted to show you guys how windy it was.
I feel like a tornado or something is coming. It's nasty out over here. That's insane. Now on the exhaust seats here, we already checked, and the depth is, I mean, just as the way the seats sit right now, we're already pushing our 48 thousandths depth on our recession. So I've adjusted the cutter here just like I did on the intake. We're gonna just cut until it just cleans up and we see that top angle, and then we're gonna check all of our depths and see if we need to cut any deeper. All of the exhaust guides have been slightly off compared to the intake guides, or compared to the seat. So there's either a concentricity issue. I wouldn't think it would be an alignment issue because the intake, I didn't see that on them, and I drilled the intake guides in the same setup as the exhaust guides. But it could be.
To clarify, what I'm talking about is as the seat is coming in, you'll see that the back side does not clean up as soon as the front side. Whereas if the guide was perfectly concentric with the seat and the guide was perfectly aligned with the seat, it would clean up almost instantly, but that's never the case when you're replacing valve guides. The point is, once the seats are finished cut on the Surdy, everything is concentric and aligned to the valve guide.
Alright, seats are wrapped up on this head. I'm going to get it on the surfacer again so we can surface the exhaust face here. And then I'm going to grind the valves. They are brand new valves, but we like to grind them just to be positive. And we'll get the head put together and start working on that other John Deere head.
One of the big things that's important in a shop like ours is that you can't be standing there watching the machine work. You have to be moving on to something else and kind of multitasking. So while the machine is surfacing the one head, we're working on doing something else on the other head. We're doing a complete valve job on this head as well, so we're going to be drilling out for the new guides that we're going to be driving in, as well as putting in seats and cutting the seats, doing the surfaces, and all new parts. Meanwhile, the other head has already finished up on the surfacer, so my dad's getting it into the spray cabinet for the final wash before assembly. For this head, we are using what I'll call more of a universal cast iron guide that is the correct size and the correct length. They are hardened as well because this is obviously kind of a severe duty type of situation in these diesel tractors. The trouble with these guides is they do drive in very hard, and they are a 3/8 ID by 1/2 inch OD, so they're super thin, super hard, and they will break because they are brittle. It just takes a little bit of extra finesse when you're installing them, and sometimes I have luck, and other times I break 4 or 5 of them trying to get them in, but luckily all you gotta do is press the broken one out and start over again, and all you're out is the cost of the valve guide. and obviously your labor cost. Again, we're using our diamond valve guide hone to set the guide clearance in these valve guides. So we've taken a measurement of the exhaust valve and the intake valve, and we've set up our split ball bore gauge so that we can accurately measure the guides, as well as using our Certi Pilot as kind of a fitment check just to quickly get an idea of, is it too tight or is it loose enough? With the length of these valve guides being pretty long, it's important to roll over and check from the other side as well to make sure that we're not ending up with any taper or any tight spots in the valve guide itself. In these guides, we're coming in right at about 3 thousandths valve stem clearance, which is right in the middle of the spec. And once we know how much honing it took on the first one, we can kind of go through and really quickly rough out the other 11 guides so that we can get this done more quickly. With that, we're going to jump over to finishing up the 414 cubic inch head, as the customer was needing it pretty badly, so we're going to get it cleaned up and put back together. As I stated earlier in the video, this head is getting all new hardware, but the valves we are going to go ahead and grind again. Even though they are brand new, it's just an extra quality assurance on our end. I did have a little bit of a mishap with my GoPro and I lost almost an entire day's footage, but I did take some of the footage on my phone, so I do still have it. Just some of it is in the vertical format, so it's a good time to remind you guys, check us out on Instagram, check us out on Facebook and TikTok, as well as check out our website where you can actually place orders for engine parts. We do sell engine parts to customers all over the world, and it's a good way to help support us if you're not a local customer who we can easily do machine work for. And with that, the first head is fully assembled and headed out the door, and we're ready to jump back into the machine work on the 466. So on this head, we are going to be cutting the valve guides for positive valve stem seals as we typically do. That also means we have to trim the guide down a little bit to make room for that seal.
There's a big one right there.
The routine is pretty well similar on this head as well, other than we are using a different cutter, which gives us a little bit wider seat, and we're cutting to different valve protrusions. So in this case of this cylinder head, the valves are supposed to protrude above the surface of the head, whereas on the previous head, they were cut to actually be receded a little bit. This style of head is actually super nice to do on the Certi because the intake seats and the exhaust seats are the same exact diameter with the same exact cutter. So we can use our tooling setup for both the intake and the exhaust, and once we know the depths that the valves need to be cut to, we can pretty much set that value on the digital readout of the machine, and we can cut until we see the spindle hit that readout number, and we know that all of the seats are going to be at the correct depth. The exhaust valves were a little bit thicker than the intake valves, meaning the seat had to be cut deeper, so I did come back with a radius cutter, which was just to clean up the sharp edge that the top angle left. With all of the machine work wrapped up on this head, it did get one final wash on the spray cabinet before moving on to the assembly with all of the new parts. As usual, the valves are installed with assembly lube on the valve stems, and yes, we did grind the valves. We also installed positive Viaton valve stem seals on the guides before going through with installing all new valve springs, rotators, and keepers. As always, we want to give our subscribers a massive thank you for watching and your support. If you know a friend who you think would like our content, be sure to send this video along, but in the meantime, be sure to drop a comment, hit that like button, and subscribe to follow along with our small business in rural America. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.